The mountain air in Pine Falls, Montana, carried the sharp, clean bite of early November. The morning frost clung stubbornly to the edges of window panes and turned the breath of early risers into small clouds of mist. Main Street, the beating heart of this town of barely 3,000 souls, was a study in quiet Americana. Brick storefronts unchanged since the 1,950 seconds, hand-painted signs creaking gently in the wind, and pickup trucks angled into parking spaces like faithful old dogs. At the far end of Main Street, where the pavement began its gradual surrender to gravel and pine forest, sat Maggie's Diner. It was the kind of place that existed outside of time. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. A sanctuary of Formica countertops, red vinyl booths patched with duct tape, and the perpetual aroma of fresh coffee, bacon grease, and cinnamon rolls. The neon sign in the window, a cursive "Open" in faded pink, had been flickering for 3 years, but no one had gotten around to fixing it. That was Pine Falls. Things got fixed when they got fixed, and in the meantime, life went on. Inside, the morning rush, if it could be called that, was in full swing. A handful of regulars occupied their usual spots, nursing coffee and swapping the same comfortable stories they'd told 100 times before. Old Bill Hendricks sat at the counter, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug, arguing good-naturedly with the waitress about the Broncos' chances this season. In the corner booth, 2 loggers still in their work clothes devoured stacks of pancakes, their forks moving with the mechanical efficiency of men who burned 4,000 calories before noon. And by the large front window, where the weak November sun cast long shadows across the worn linoleum floor, sat Margaret Hayes. Margaret, known to everyone in town as Maggie, the diner's namesake, was 76 years old. She had the kind of face that told stories without words. Deep laugh lines around her eyes, hands gnarled from decades of work, and posture that spoke of a spine that had bent under the weight of loss but never broken. Her white hair was pulled back in a neat bun, secured with the same silver clip her late husband had given her 40 years ago. She wore a simple cardigan, the color of autumn leaves, over a floral dress, practical shoes, and a wedding ring she'd never taken off, even though Thomas had been gone for 8 years now. This was her ritual. Every Saturday morning, same booth, same order, black coffee, 1 piece of wheat toast with butter, and a newspaper she'd already read, cover to cover at home, but brought with her anyway, because it gave her hands something to do. The truth was, Maggie came here not for the food, but for the life. After Thomas died, the silence of her small house on Elm Street had become suffocating. Here, surrounded by familiar faces and the comfortable clatter of dishes, she felt less alone. She had just taken a sip of her coffee, savoring its bitter warmth, when the front door opened with enough force to make the little bell above it sound less like a welcome and more like an alarm. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop. 3 men entered, and they brought with them an energy that was immediately, viscerally wrong. They were dressed in expensive outdoor gear, the kind city people wore when they wanted to look rugged without ever being in actual danger. Designer fleece jackets, pristine hiking boots that had never seen a trail, and sunglasses that cost more than most of the diner's monthly rent. They moved with the loud, entitled confidence of men who had never been told no in their entire lives. The man in the center was clearly the alpha. His name was Damian Cross, though the people of Pine Falls didn't know that yet. They would soon enough. He was in his early 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of physique that came from expensive personal trainers, not hard work. His hair was silver at the temples, perfectly styled, and his face had the smooth, slightly unnatural look of someone who'd had work done. He wore a cashmere sweater under his North Face jacket and carried himself with the easy arrogance of a man worth $900 million. His 2 companions were younger, mid-30s, both cut from the same cloth. Corporate lawyers or consultants, interchangeable in their expensive mediocrity. They laughed too loudly at everything Damian said, their eyes constantly flicking to him for approval, like dogs waiting for a treat. Damian stopped just inside the door, his gaze sweeping the diner with the cold assessment of a man evaluating an acquisition. His lip curled slightly, as if he'd smelled something unpleasant. "Jesus Christ," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the comfortable murmur of conversation. "This place is a time capsule. Is that actual linoleum? I haven't seen that since the '80s. His companions laughed obediently. The regulars at the counter exchanged glances but said nothing. In Pine Falls, you didn't start trouble. You waited to see what kind of trouble was coming. Behind the counter, Joanne Reeves, the head waitress and one of Maggie's closest friends, felt her jaw tighten. She was a woman in her late 50s, built solid from years of lifting trays and dealing with difficult customers, but something about these three men set her teeth on edge. "Seats are open," she said, her voice polite but cool. "Coffee?" Damien ignored her completely. He walked to the center of the diner, his boots clicking on the floor like a countdown, and stopped. He pulled out his phone, held it up, and began taking pictures. "Chad, look at this," he said to one of his companions, zooming in on a faded photograph on the wall, a black and white image of the town's founders. "This is perfect. This is exactly the kind of authentic American decay our investors want to see. Proof that these places are dying, that they need us." Chad laughed. "Should we stage a photo with one of the locals? Maybe the old lady by the window? Give it that real poverty-stricken vibe?" They both looked at Maggie. She felt their eyes on her like a physical weight. She lowered her coffee cup slowly, her hands beginning to tremble, not from fear, but from a rising, unfamiliar anger. She had lived through the Depression as a child. She had buried a husband. She had raised a son who grew up to serve his country. She did not need to be looked at like she was a museum exhibit. Damien walked over to her booth. He didn't ask to sit. He simply slid into the seat across from her, his phone still in his hand. "Morning," he said, his tone a parody of friendliness. "Mind if I ask you a few questions? Doing some research on the area. You've lived here a long time, I'm guessing?" Maggie's voice was quiet but steady. "I'm having my breakfast." Right, Damien said, not moving. "Won't take long. I'm curious, do you own property here? A house? Because I'm with Cross Development Group. We're looking to acquire land in this area. Beautiful country. Wasted on outdated infrastructure, but beautiful. If you're interested in selling, I can make you an offer you won't believe." "I'm not interested," Maggie said, her tone final. "Now, if you'll excuse me." Damien's smile didn't falter, but something cold flickered in his eyes. He leaned back, spreading his arms across the top of the booth as if he owned it. "You know," he said, louder now, making sure the rest of the diner could hear, "that's the problem with places like this. Stubbornness. People clinging to the past when the world's moved on. It's sad, really." Joanne appeared at the edge of the booth, her order pad in hand, her expression hard. "Sir, the lady asked you to leave her alone. There are other seats." Damien looked up at her, his smile widening into something cruel. "And I'm having a conversation. Last I checked, that wasn't illegal." Old Bill Hendricks at the counter turned on his stool. "Son, you're being rude. Maggie's a good woman. Leave." "Herbie." Damien's face darkened. The mask of civility was slipping. "Are you the owner of this establishment?" "No," Bill said. "Then shut your mouth." The entire diner went silent. Even the kitchen sound seemed to stop. Damien stood up, his height and bulk suddenly intimidating in the cramped space. He looked down at Maggie, who was still sitting, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale but composed. "Let me be very clear," Damien said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing register. "I am going to buy this entire town. I already own 40% of the land here, and in 6 months, I'll own the rest. I'm turning this place into a luxury resort destination. Ski lodges, boutique hotels, the works. People like you? You're in the way. You're the dead weight we're going to cut loose." He leaned down, putting his hands on the table, bringing his face close to hers. "So here's my advice, old woman. Take whatever pennies you have, get out while you still can, and go die. Somewhere quietly where you won't be a problem." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. The cruelty of the words, the casual viciousness, hit her like a physical blow. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, tears of rage and helplessness. "You need to leave," Joanne said, her voice shaking with fury. "Right now." Damien straightened up, smoothing his sweater. "Actually," he said, pulling out his phone again, "I think she needs to leave." He scrolled through his phone with theatrical slowness, then turned the screen to face Joanne. "According to the property records I pulled this morning, Cross Development Group purchased this building 3 days ago. Congratulations. You're all working for me now." Joanne's face went white. "That's not possible. Old Man Carmichael owns this building." "He would never—" "Old Man Carmichael is 92 and in a nursing home in Billings," Damien said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "His daughter has power of attorney. She was very motivated to sell, especially after I explained how a protracted legal battle over some unpaid property taxes could drain whatever's left of Daddy's estate." He turned his attention back to Maggie, who was still sitting frozen in the booth, her world tilting on its axis. "So, as the new owner," Damien said, his voice rising so everyone could hear, "I'm exercising my right to refuse service. You, old woman, are no longer welcome in my establishment. Get out." Maggie looked up at him, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I've been coming here for 30 years. "And now you're done," Damien said coldly. "Chad, Brett, help the lady understand." His two companions moved forward, flanking the booth. Maggie felt a surge of panic. She reached for her purse, her hands shaking. "I said out," Damien roared, slamming his hand down on the table so hard her coffee cup jumped, splashing hot liquid across the faded Formica. And that's when the door opened. The little bell rang, a soft, incongruous sound in the sudden, terrible silence. The man who entered moved with a kind of economy that was immediately noticeable. He wasn't large, not in the way Damien was large, but there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested coiled power, a spring wound tight and ready to release. He was in his late 30s, just over 6 feet, with the lean, hard build of someone whose body was a tool kept in perfect working condition. His hair was dark and military short. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, swept the room in a single, comprehensive glance that missed nothing. He wore a simple black jacket over a faded gray t-shirt, worn jeans, and boots that had actually seen use. On his left shoulder was a small, subdued patch, a trident, a Navy SEAL insignia. Most people wouldn't have recognized it. The men in the diner did. At his side, moving with perfect synchronization, was a dog. The Belgian Malinois was a creature of pure, focused intensity, 85 pounds of muscle, and controlled aggression, his coat a deep mahogany and black, his ears erect and constantly scanning. His name was Titan, though the small tag on his tactical collar simply read MWD, Military Working Dog. He wore a simple black vest, no longer his official gear, but the way he moved, the way his dark eyes tracked every person in the room, left no doubt. This was not a pet. This was a weapon. The man's name was Jack Hayes. He was Maggie's son, and he had just driven 14 hours straight from his base in Virginia to surprise his mother for her birthday. He had expected to walk into laughter and the smell of coffee and his mother's surprised, delighted face. Instead, he walked into a nightmare. His eyes found her immediately. She was sitting in her booth, her face pale and streaked with tears, a large, expensively dressed man looming over her, 2 others flanking her like enforcers. Jack's expression didn't change. He didn't shout. He didn't rush forward. He simply stopped, 5 feet inside the door, and in a voice that was barely above a conversational tone, but somehow carried to every corner of the diner, he said, "Step away from her." Damien turned, irritation flashing across his face. "And who the hell are you? This is a private matter. Get out." Jack didn't move. "I'm her son. This is your last chance. Step away." Titan, sensing the shift in his handler's body language, the subtle tensing of muscles, took 1 step forward. He didn't growl. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, his gaze locked on Damien with the unwavering focus of a predator that had selected its prey. Damien looked from the dog to the man and felt, for the first time in years, a tiny flicker of something he'd almost forgotten: uncertainty. But he was Damien Cross. He was worth nearly $1 billion. He owned senators. He crushed companies. He was not going to be intimidated by some hick with a dog in a backwoods diner. "Your mother," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "is trespassing on my property. I've asked her to leave. If you have a problem with that, you can call the sheriff. I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear." "You made her cry," Jack said quietly. The simplicity of the statement, the way it cut through all of Damien's bluster and posturing, was more unsettling than any threat. Damien laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "So what? She's an old woman squatting in my diner. I told her to leave. If she got her feelings hurt, that's her problem, not mine." Jack turned his head slightly, his eyes never leaving Damien, and spoke a single word. "Watch." Titan moved instantly. He flowed forward, placing himself directly between Jack and the three men, his body low, his muscles coiled. This time, a sound did come from him, a low, continuous growl that seemed to vibrate the air itself. It was not a warning, it was a promise. Chad and Brett, the two companions, immediately took several steps back, their hands raised. "Whoa, hey man, control your dog," Chad stammered, his face going pale. But Damien, driven by pride and rage at being challenged, made the fatal mistake. He reached out and grabbed Maggie by the arm, hauling her roughly out of the booth. "I said, get out, you useless old—" He never finished the sentence. Jack moved. To the people watching, it happened so fast it was almost impossible to track. One moment Jack was standing by the door. The next, he was across the room, his hand clamping down on Damien's wrist with such force that the bones ground together audibly. Damien's face contorted in shock and pain. He tried to pull away, but it was like his arm was caught in a hydraulic press. Jack's grip was absolute. "Let her go," Jack said, his voice still quiet, still controlled, but now carrying an edge that was as sharp and cold as a surgical blade. "You're assaulting me." Damien gasped, his composure shattering. "I'll have you arrested. I'll sue you for everything you—" Jack twisted his wrist, a precise, economical movement. Damien's hand opened involuntarily, releasing Maggie's arm. Then, in one smooth motion, Jack used Damien's own momentum against him, stepping behind him and applying pressure to a nerve cluster in his shoulder. Damien's knees buckled, and he found himself forced down onto one knee on the diner floor, his arm bent behind him in a control hold that was perfectly calibrated. Any resistance, any attempt to fight back, would result in a dislocated shoulder or broken arm. He was completely, utterly helpless. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds. Chad and Brett stood frozen, their eyes wide, their mouths hanging open. They had watched their boss, a man who ruled boardrooms with an iron fist, be taken down like a child by someone who hadn't even raised his voice. Jack looked at his mother. Maggie was standing by the booth, clutching her purse, tears streaming down her face. His heart, which had been ice-cold and focused during the takedown, cracked. "Mom," he said, his voice softening just for her. "Are you hurt? Did he hurt you?" "I'm okay," she whispered, though her voice was shaking. "I'm okay, Jack. I'm just so glad you're here." "I'm here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked down at Damien, who was kneeling on the floor, his face red with humiliation and rage. "You have 5 seconds to apologize to my mother," Jack said, his tone conversational. "If you don't, I'm going to let my partner have a turn." Titan, on cue, took one step forward. His growl deepened. His lips pulled back just enough to reveal teeth that were designed by millions of years of evolution to tear through flesh and bone. "Apologize," Jack repeated. Damien's pride, his entire sense of self, warred with the very real, primal fear flooding his system. He looked up and saw not just a man, but something far more dangerous. A man with training, with purpose, and with absolutely no fear of consequences. "I'm sorry." Damien choked out the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. "Louder," Jack said. "And look at her when you say it." Damien turned his head, his face a mask of impotent rage and humiliation, and looked at Maggie. "I'm sorry," he said, louder this time. Jack released him, stepping back in one smooth motion. Damien scrambled to his feet, clutching his shoulder, his perfectly styled hair disheveled, his cashmere sweater wrinkled. "You have no idea what you just did," Damien hissed, his voice trembling with fury. "I am going to destroy you. I own this town. I own the sheriff. I will have you arrested. I will sue you into oblivion. Your life is over." Jack looked at him with an expression that was almost pitying. "I'm a Navy SEAL. I've been shot at by people a lot scarier than you. And I'm still here." He moved to his mother, gently taking her arm and guiding her away from Damien, away from the booth, and toward the door. Titan backed up with them, never taking his eyes off the three men. Old Bill at the counter stood, up, his weathered face set in hard lines. "Maggie, you come back whenever you want. I don't care who owns this building. This is your place." A murmur of agreement rose from the other patrons. In that moment, the people of Pine Falls had chosen their side. Damien, seeing his power crumbling, made one last desperate attempt to assert control. "Fine, leave. But mark my words, this whole town is mine. In 6 months, every single one of you will be gone. You'll be working for me, or you'll be homeless. That's a promise." Jack paused at the door. He looked back at Damien, his expression unreadable. "We'll see," he said quietly. Then he was gone, guiding his mother out into the cold. November morning, Titan at his side, leaving behind a diner full of stunned silence and one very shaken billionaire who was beginning to realize he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Outside, the mountain air hit Maggie like a balm. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and then the tears came in, earnest. Jack wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight while she sobbed into his chest. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner." "You're here now," she said, her voice muffled. "That's all that matters. You're here now." Titan sat beside them, his body relaxed now that the threat was gone, but his eyes still scanning the street, still on guard. Jack pulled back slightly, looking down at his mother's tear-stained face. "Who is that man?" "Damien Cross," Maggie said, wiping her eyes with a tissue from her purse. "He's a developer. Jack, he's been buying up the whole town. People are scared. He's rich and he's ruthless, and he has the sheriff in his pocket. He said he's going to turn Pine Falls into some kind of resort. He wants everyone gone." Jack's jaw tightened. "Is our house safe?" Maggie nodded. "For now, I own it outright, but he's been making offers, threatening really. He's told half the town that if they don't sell, he'll make their lives miserable. Increased property taxes, code violations, you name it." Jack looked down Main Street, at the familiar storefronts, the mountains rising in the distance, the place he'd grown up. This wasn't just a town, this was his mother's home, this was his history. "He's not going to win," Jack said quietly. Maggie looked up at her son. She saw the same determination in his eyes that his father had once carried. Thomas Hayes had been a quiet man, a good man, who had taught their son that strength wasn't about how loud you were, but about what you stood for. "Jack, he's powerful. He has money and lawyers, and I have something he doesn't," Jack said, looking down at Titan, who gazed back with absolute, unwavering loyalty. "I have a mission, and I never leave a mission unfinished." He took his mother's hand. "Come on, let's get you home. I have a birthday surprise for you, and I'm not letting him ruin it." As they walked down Main Street toward Maggie's small house on Aid morning, Elm, neither of them noticed the black SUV parked across the street, or the man inside with a camera, taking pictures. Back in the diner, Damien Cross was on his phone, his voice low and venomous. "I don't care what it costs. I want everything on him. Jack Hayes. I want to know where he works, who he knows, what he cares about. I want leverage, and I want it by tonight." He ended the call and looked at Chad and Brett, who were both still pale and shaken. "This isn't over," Damien said, his voice cold. "Not even close. The war for Pine Falls had just begun." Maggie's house was a small, well-kept craftsman on Elm Street, its white paint slightly faded, but its garden lovingly maintained even this late in the year. Wind chimes hung from the porch, their gentle song a stark contrast to the violence of the morning. Jack helped his mother up the steps. Titan trotting ahead to sniff the perimeter, his training never fully at rest. Inside, the house smelled like home: old wood, lavender, sachets, and the faint lingering scent of the cinnamon candles his mother loved. It was exactly as he remembered it, frozen in time. The same floral couch, the same knitted afghan draped over the back, the same photographs on the mantel. Maggie sank into her favorite chair by the window, exhausted by the emotional toll of the morning. Jack disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a glass of water and her medication, which he'd spotted on the counter. "Here, Mom. Take these." She obeyed, her hand still trembling slightly. "You remembered my schedule." "I always remember," he said gently, kneeling beside her chair. Titan came over and rested his head on her lap, a gesture of comfort. She stroked his soft ears, and Jack saw some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Tell me everything," Jack said. "From the beginning. When did this start?" Maggie took a deep breath and began. She told him about how Cross Development Group had appeared about 8 months ago, quietly buying land from absentee owners and people desperate for cash. At first, it seemed like a good thing: new investment, new jobs. But then the tactics changed. Damian Cross arrived personally 3 months ago, and the pressure intensified. Property taxes mysteriously increased. Small businesses found themselves facing sudden health inspections that resulted in expensive violations. People who refused to sell found their lives becoming increasingly difficult. "Sheriff Mathers won't help," Maggie said, her voice bitter. "He's on Cross's payroll. Everyone knows it, but no one can prove it. And most people are too scared to fight back. The ones who have spoken up, their businesses have been ruined. The Patterson family who owned the gas station, they held out for 2 months. Then suddenly their fuel supplier canceled their contract. They had to sell at 1/3 of what their property was worth." Jack listened, his expression growing darker with every word. This wasn't just aggressive business. This was systematic intimidation. This was a coordinated campaign to crush an entire community. "What about the mayor, the town council?" Maggie shook her head. "Mayor Brennan is 80 years old and barely functional. The council is split. Half of them think Cross Development will save the town's economy. The other half are too afraid to speak out." Jack stood up, pacing to the window. He looked out at the quiet street, the neighboring houses, the American flags hanging limply in the still air. His mother had lived here for 40 years. His father was buried in the cemetery on the hill. This wasn't just real estate to be traded. This was community. This was memory. This was home. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from his commanding officer. "Heard you're on leave. Enjoyed the downtime. You've earned it." Jack almost laughed at the bitter irony. He'd come home to rest, to escape the weight of constant vigilance, the responsibility of life and death decisions. Instead, he'd walked into another war, just on a different battlefield. "Jack," his mother's voice pulled him back. "I don't want you to get hurt because of me. That man, Cross, he's dangerous in ways you're not used to. He doesn't fight with guns. He fights with lawyers and money and connections." Jack turned to face her. "Mom, I've spent the last 15 years fighting people who wanted to kill me. I think I can handle one bully with a checkbook." There was a knock at the door. Titan was on his feet instantly, a low warning growl rumbling in his chest. Jack moved to the door, looking through the peephole. It was Joanne from the diner, holding a covered dish. Jack opened the door. "Joanne." "Hey, Jack," she said, her face weary but warm. "Brought your mom some soup. Figured after this morning she could use something warm." She stepped inside, setting the dish on the small table by the door. Then she turned to Jack, her expression serious. "That was a hell of a thing you did back there. Most people would have just called the cops and let that bastard throw your mom out. You stood up to him." "Anyone would have done the same," Jack said. "No," Joanne said firmly. "They wouldn't have. Most folks in this town are too scared, and they're right to be scared. Jack, you need to know what you're up against. Damian Cross doesn't just threaten, he follows through." She glanced at Maggie, then back to Jack. 3 weeks ago, a man named Robert Chen refused to sell his auto shop. 2 days later, his shop burned down. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible true stories of courage and loyalty. Fire marshal said it was an electrical fire, but Bob is an electrician. He'd just rewired the whole place. The insurance company is fighting the claim, saying he's being investigated for arson. Jack's expression hardened. Do you think Cross was behind it? I know he was, Joanne said, but knowing and proving are two different things. Cross has a guy. His name is Derek Klein. He's officially Cross's head of security, but everyone knows what he really is. He's an enforcer, a fixer. When Cross wants something done that his lawyers can't handle, Klein handles it. Jack filed the name away. What else do I need to know? Joanne sighed. Cross owns the bank, literally. He bought Pine Falls Community Bank last month. So, if anyone needs a loan to fight him legally, guess who controls their access to money? He also bought the local newspaper. The Pine Falls Gazette ran one critical article about his methods, and the editor was fired the next day. What about outside help? Jack asked. State authorities? FBI? For what? Joanne spread her hands helplessly. What crime has been committed that we can prove? Everything Cross does, he does legally. Aggressive business practices aren't a crime. The fire was ruled accidental. The property sales are all legitimate. He's very, very good at staying just on the right side of the law. Jack was silent for a moment, processing. This was asymmetric warfare of a different kind. His enemy controlled the terrain, the supply lines, and the local authorities. A frontal assault would fail. There has to be something, Jack said quietly, more to himself than to Joanne. Everyone has a weak point. Everyone makes mistakes. Maybe, Joanne said, but you need to be careful. After what happened this morning, you're on his radar now. He's going to come after you. Let him, Jack said, his voice calm and certain. I'm not going anywhere. After Joanne left, Jack sat down with his mother, and they shared the soup in comfortable silence. The normalcy of the act, the simple ritual of a meal together, was grounding. For a few minutes, the threat outside faded, but Jack's mind was already working. He was trained to assess threats, to identify objectives, and to plan operations. Cross Development Group was the enemy force. Pine Falls was the civilian population that needed protection. His mother was the primary asset. His mission, defend and preserve. But to do that effectively, he needed intelligence. He needed to know his enemy. That evening, after his mother had gone to bed, Jack sat in his father's old study, a small room lined with books and smelling of pipe tobacco, even years after Thomas Hayes had passed. Jack opened his laptop and began to research. Damian Cross was easy to find. He was a darling of certain business publications, praised for his ability to revitalize distressed communities. The profile was always the same. Buy up cheap land in economically depressed areas, push out the existing residents and businesses, then redevelop as luxury destinations for wealthy outsiders. He'd done it in Colorado, Wyoming, and now Montana. Each time, the local population was displaced. Each time, Cross made hundreds of millions. And each time, he walked away legally untouchable. But Jack had been trained to look deeper, to find the patterns, the weaknesses. He pulled up property records, business filings, and news archives. After 2 hours of digging, a pattern began to emerge. Cross Development Group had a history of fires and accidents at properties whose owners refused to sell. Nothing ever tied directly back to Cross, but the timing was always suspicious. Insurance claims were always contested. Owners were always forced to sell at a loss. There was also a trail of lawsuits. Most were settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements, but a few had gone to trial. In those cases, the plaintiffs alleged intimidation, harassment, and in 2 cases, physical threats. None of the cases had resulted in convictions. Cross's legal team was too good. But there was one case that caught Jack's attention. A woman named Linda Vasquez had sued Cross Development Group 5 years ago in Colorado. She claimed that after refusing to sell her ranch, her cattle had been poisoned, her fences cut, and her teenage son had been run off the road by an unmarked truck. The case had been dismissed due to lack of evidence, but Vasquez had given an interview to a small, independent news site afterward. In it, she named Derek Klein as the man who had personally delivered threats to her family. Jack found a phone number for Vasquez. It was late, nearly midnight, but he called anyway. A woman answered on the third ring, her voice cautious. "Hello? Mrs. Vasquez? My name is Jack Hayes. I'm very sorry to call so late. I'm hoping you can help me with some information about Damian Cross." There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was hard. "Are you a lawyer?" "No, ma'am. I'm a Navy SEAL. Cross is trying to do to my hometown what he did to yours. My mother was threatened today. I'm trying to stop him." Another pause. Then, "Cross doesn't stop. We fought him for 2 years and it destroyed us. We lost everything. Our ranch, our savings, our peace of mind. My son still has nightmares about being run off that road." "I'm sorry," Jack said quietly, "but I need to know about Derek Klein. Is he the one who made the threats?" "Yes," Linda said, her voice trembling with old anger. "He came to our house one night. My husband and son were gone. It was just me. He didn't threaten me directly. He was too smart for that. He just stood on our porch and told me a story about a family in Wyoming who'd had a house fire. Everyone died. Then he left. 3 days later, someone cut our brake lines. Did you report it to the police?" "Of course we did. They said they'd investigate. They never did. We later found out the sheriff had received a substantial campaign contribution from one of Cross's shell companies. Would you be willing to testify about any of this? Make a sworn statement?" Linda laughed, a bitter sound. "To who? We tried that. Cross's lawyers buried us. And even if I wanted to, I can't. I signed an NDA as part of the settlement. If I talk, I lose the only compensation we got for losing our home." Jack understood. Cross had learned to silence his victims with money and legal threats. But NDAs didn't apply to criminal activity. They only worked if no one could prove a crime had been committed. "Mrs. Vasquez, thank you for your time, and I'm truly sorry for what happened to your family." "Mr. Hayes," Linda said, her voice softening, "if you're really going to fight him, be smart. Don't fight him in court. You'll lose. Fight him in the open, where people can see. Sunlight is the only thing he's afraid of." Jack ended the call and sat in the dark study, thinking, sunlight, transparency, public attention. Cross had operated in the shadows for years, using intimidation and legal maneuvering. But he'd made a mistake this morning. He'd done it in public, in front of witnesses, and Jack had stopped him. A plan was beginning to form. The next morning, Jack woke before dawn. Old habits died hard. He went for a run with Titan, 6 miles through the quiet streets of Pine Falls, past darkened houses and closed shops. The cold November air burned his lungs in a way that felt clean and clarifying. When he returned, his mother was already awake, making coffee. She looked better. The color returned to her face, though he could see the lingering worry in her eyes. "Morning, Mom." "Morning, sweetheart. There are eggs in the fridge if you want breakfast." "I'll cook," Jack said. "You sit." As he scrambled eggs and made toast, he told her his plan. It was risky, but it was the only path forward he could see. "I'm going to force him into the open," Jack said. "Cross operates on fear and secrecy, so I'm going to take those away. I'm calling a town meeting for tonight. I want everyone there. I want them to see that someone is willing to stand up to him." Maggie frowned. "Jack, no one will come. They're too afraid." "Then I'll go to them, door to door. I'm going to talk to every person in this town, and I'm going to tell them what happened yesterday. And I'm going to ask them to share their own stories, anonymously if they have to, but I want the truth out there." "And what will that accomplish?" "It will create a record," Jack said. "Right now, Cross can claim everything he's done is legitimate business. But if we can document a pattern of intimidation, of harassment, of threats, then we have something to take to state authorities or the FBI. And even if they don't act, we have the court of public opinion." Maggie looked at her son, seeing the strategist in him, the man who had spent years planning operations in hostile territory. You really think this will work? I think it's our best shot, Jack said honestly. Cross has money and lawyers, but we have something he doesn't. We have the truth. And we have each other. She reached out and squeezed his hand. Your father would be so proud of you. Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He thought of his father, a quiet man who had worked at the lumber mill for 40 years, who had taught him to fish and to fix cars and to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. I hope so, Jack said quietly. After breakfast, Jack began his campaign. He walked Main Street, going into every shop, every business. He introduced himself, shook hands, and asked people to come to a meeting that night at the community center. The reactions were mixed. Some people were grateful, eager to finally have someone willing to fight. Others were skeptical, wary of drawing Cross's attention, but Jack was patient. He listened to their stories. The baker whose lease had been terminated without cause after he refused to sell. The librarian whose funding had been mysteriously cut. The young family who had been denied a mortgage for no apparent reason, only to discover the bank was now owned by Cross Development Group. Each story was a piece of a larger puzzle, a pattern of systematic oppression. By mid-afternoon, Jack had talked to nearly 50 people. He'd also been followed. The same black SUV from yesterday had been trailing him, not even trying to be subtle. It was a message. We're watching you. Jack ignored it. Let them watch. At 4 o'clock, he returned home to find a car parked in front of his mother's house. It was a sleek, silver sedan, expensive and out of place on this modest street. As Jack approached, the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out. He was in his 40s, well-built, with a shaved head and the bearing of someone who'd seen combat. He wore dark jeans, a leather jacket, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Jack Hayes?" he said, his voice smooth. "That's me." "Derek Klein," the man said, extending a hand. "I work for Mr. Cross. Mind if we talk?" Jack didn't take the hand. "I know who you are, and no, I don't mind, but we're doing it out here, in the open." Klein withdrew his hand, the smile never wavering. "Fair enough. Look, I'm going to cut to the chase. Yesterday was a misunderstanding. Mr. Cross was having a bad day. He was stressed. He said some things he shouldn't have. He wants to apologize. In fact, he'd like to invite you and your mother to dinner tonight. On him. A peace offering. Tell him thanks, but no thanks." Klein's smile tightened. "He's also prepared to make a very generous offer on your mother's property. Triple the assessed value. Cash. She could retire somewhere warm, somewhere nice. No more Montana winters. My mother's not selling." "Everyone sells eventually," Klein said, his tone still pleasant, but with an edge now. "It's just a question of price. Mr. Cross is prepared to be very accommodating. All he asks is that you stop trying to turn the town against him. Don't organize any meetings. Don't spread lies. Just take the money and move on." Jack took a step closer. Titan, who had been sitting quietly at his heel, rose to his feet. Klein's eyes flicked to the dog nervously. "Here's what's going to happen," Jack said, his voice low and calm. "You're going to get back in your car. You're going to drive away. And you're going to tell your boss that if he ever threatens my mother again, if he ever sets foot near her, if he even thinks about her, I will make it my life's mission to destroy everything he's built. Do you understand?" Klein's pleasant mask slipped, revealing something cold and dangerous underneath. "You really don't know who you're fucking with, do you? Cross owns this town. He owns you. And when he gets bored playing nice, he'll crush you like an insect." "I've been threatened by better men than you," Jack said. "Usually right before I put them in the ground." The two men stared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut. Finally, Klein stepped back, opening his car door. "You're making a big mistake, Hayes. This could have been easy. Now it's going to be hard." He got in his car and drove away, the engine's roar unnecessarily loud, a petulant show of power. Jack watched him go, then turned to find his mother standing in the doorway, her face pale. "You heard?" She nodded. "I'm not going to let him hurt you," Jack said. "I promise you that." "I know," Maggie said. "I just wish you didn't have to fight my battles." Jack walked up the steps and pulled her into a hug. "Mom, Your battles are my battles. That's how family works. That night, the Pine Falls Community Center was surprisingly full. Jack had expected maybe 20 people. Instead, nearly 80 crowded into the small space, sitting in folding chairs, standing along the walls. The word had spread. The people were scared, but they were also angry. And anger, properly channeled, was a powerful force. Jack stood at the front of the room, no microphone, no podium, just him and Titan, facing his neighbors. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I know a lot of you don't know me. I'm Maggie Hayes' son. I grew up here. And yesterday, I watched a man humiliate my mother in her own town. A man who thinks his money gives him the right to treat people like garbage." He looked around the room, meeting eyes. "But I know it's not just my mom. I've spent today talking to you, and I've heard your stories. The intimidation, the threats, the systematic campaign to drive you out of your own homes." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Damian Cross wants us to be afraid. He wants us to sell cheap and leave quietly. He wants Pine Falls to disappear so he can build his luxury resort on our graves." "What can we do about it?" someone shouted from the back. "He owns the sheriff. He owns the bank. He owns half the damn county." "He owns property," Jack said. "He doesn't own us, and he doesn't own the truth. What I'm proposing is simple. We document everything, every threat, every suspicious incident, every intimidation tactic. We create a record that can't be ignored. And then we take it to every news outlet, every state agency, every person who will listen until someone finally acts." "And if they don't?" old Bill Hendricks asked. "What then?" Jack was silent for a moment. "Then we make enough noise that they have to listen. We make this public. We make it embarrassing. We make it impossible for Cross to operate in." The shadows. "That's a nice speech," a woman in the front row said, her voice bitter. "But you're a Navy SEAL. You can fight. Most of us are just ordinary people. We have jobs, families. We can't afford to lose what little we have left." "I understand that," Jack said. "And I'm not asking anyone to put themselves in danger. What I'm asking is for you to trust me. Trust that if we stand together, we're stronger than any one man, no matter how much money he has." There was a long, uncertain silence. People exchanged glances, fear and hope warring on their faces. Finally, old Bill stood up. "I'm in. I've lived in Pine Falls for 67 years. I'll be damned if some rich bastard is going to run me out now." One by one, others stood. The baker, the librarian, Joanne from the diner, a retired teacher, a young couple with a baby. Within minutes, half the room was on their feet. Jack felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "All right," he said. "Here's what we do. I've set up an encrypted email account. If you have information, documents, recordings, photographs, anything that shows Cross's tactics, send it to me. Anonymously if you want. I'll compile everything into a comprehensive report." "And then what?" someone asked. "Then we go to war," Jack said quietly. "But we do it smart." The meeting lasted another hour, people sharing stories, making plans. By the time everyone left, Jack had commitments from over 50 households to contribute evidence. As he was locking up the community center, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You should have taken the deal. Last chance. Walk away or suffer the consequences." Jack deleted the message. He'd received death threats from Al-Qaeda fighters. A text from a corrupt businessman didn't even register. But as he walked home with Titan under the cold Montana stars, he knew the real battle was just beginning. Cross wouldn't take this challenge lightly. He would escalate. The question was, how far would he go? Jack didn't have to wait long to find out. The next morning, he woke to the sound of sirens. He threw on clothes and ran outside to find thick black smoke billowing into the pre-dawn sky. The source was 3 blocks away. The community center was on fire. By the time Jack arrived, the building was fully engulfed, flames roaring through the roof. Fire trucks surrounded it, firefighters battling the blaze, but it was clear the building was a total loss. Jack stood at the edge of the police tape. Titan pressed against his leg and watched his town's heart burn. Around him, neighbors gathered, their faces reflecting the orange glow, their expressions a mix of shock and a terrible understanding. This was Cross's answer. Fire Chief Martinez, a man Jack had known since childhood, approached him, his face soot-stained and grim. "Jack, hell of a thing. What happened?" Martinez glanced around, making sure no one else was close enough to hear. "Officially? Don't know yet. Have to wait for the investigation. Unofficially?" He lowered his voice. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I know arson when I see it. Accelerant pattern, multiple points of origin. This was deliberate. Any cameras? Nope. Town's been meaning to install them, but never had the budget. Convenient, right?" Jack's jaw tightened. "What are the odds the fire marshal's office will rule this arson?" Martinez snorted. "About the same odds I'll sprout wings. The fire marshal is appointed by the county commissioner. Want to guess who the commissioner's biggest donor is? Damian Cross. Bingo." Jack looked at the burning building, at the place where just hours ago his neighbors had stood up and said they wouldn't be intimidated. Now their meeting place was ash. It was a message, a demonstration of power. We can reach you, we can hurt you, and no one will stop us. But as Jack stood there, feeling the heat of the flames on his face, he didn't feel fear. He felt fury. Cold, focused, strategic fury. Cross had just made a mistake. He'd proven Jack right. He'd shown the entire town that everything Jack had said the night before was true. Cross was dangerous. Cross was lawless. And Cross needed to be stopped. "Chief," Jack said quietly, "I need a favor. Name it. I need photographs of this fire, the burn patterns, the accelerant traces, everything that proves it was arson, unofficial, just for my records." Martinez studied Jack's face for a long moment. "You're not going to do anything stupid, are you, son?" "I'm going to do something very smart," Jack said. "I'm going to give Cross exactly what he wants, a fight. But on my terms, not his." The chief nodded slowly. "I'll have the photos to you by tonight." As the sun rose over Pine Falls, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of blood orange, Jack made a decision. Playing defense wasn't going to work. Cross controlled too much of the playing field. It was time to go on offense. It was time to take the fight directly to Damian Cross. But first, he needed backup. And he knew exactly who to call. 3 days later, a convoy of 3 vehicles rolled into Pine Falls. They were unremarkable. A dusty pickup truck, a well-used Jeep, and a motorcycle that had seen better days. But the men who climbed out of them were anything but ordinary. Jack had made a single phone call to his old team leader, Master Chief Marcus Stone Steele. The message had been simple. "I need help. Small town in Montana. Corrupt developer. Intimidation and arson. Bring whoever's available." Stone had responded within an hour. "On our way." Now, standing in Maggie's small living room, Jack faced 4 of his former teammates, men he'd fought beside in some of the darkest corners of the world. Stone was in his late 40s, built like a tank, with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He'd been Jack's mentor and commanding officer for 6 years. Beside him stood Doc Martinez, a former Navy corpsman who could treat a gunshot wound with a probbed paperclip and duct tape. He was lean and wiry, with quick, intelligent eyes and hands that never stopped moving. Rabbit Chen was the youngest of the group, barely 30, a communication specialist and tech genius who could hack a satellite network with a smartphone and a prayer. And finally, there was Grizz Morrison, a mountain of a man who'd gotten his nickname from wrestling an actual grizzly bear in Alaska during a survival training exercise. He stood 6'5" and had the temperament of a teddy bear, right up until someone he cared about was threatened. Then he became something far more dangerous. "So," Stone said, accepting a cup of coffee from Maggie with a polite nod. "You called us out of our retirement for a real estate dispute?" Jack smiled thinly. "It's a little more complicated than that." Over the next hour, he laid out everything. The systematic intimidation, the suspicious fires and accidents, the corruption of local officials, the assault on his mother, the burning of the community center. He showed them the evidence he'd been collecting, the stories from townspeople, the pattern of abuse stretching back years. When he finished, the room was silent. The men exchanged glances, a wordless communication honed over years of working together in life-or-death situations. Finally, Stone spoke. "So, you want to take down a billionaire who owns half the county, has the law in his pocket, and isn't afraid to burn buildings to get his way. Am I understanding this correctly?" "That's about the size of it," Jack said. "Good," Stone said, a fierce grin spreading across his weathered face. "I was getting bored anyway." "What's the op?" Grizz asked, cracking his knuckles. Jack pulled out a map of Pine Falls and spread it on the coffee table. "We're going to do what we do best. Gather intelligence, identify weak points, and strike where he's vulnerable. Cross has been operating in the shadows because no one has been able to prove his crimes. We're going to change that. We're going to surveil his operation, document everything, and get evidence that even corrupt officials can't ignore." "And if that doesn't work?" Doc asked. "Then we get creative," Jack said. "Cross thinks he's untouchable because he has money and lawyers. He's never faced an opposition force that doesn't play by those rules. We're going to make his life so difficult, so public, so expensive, that he'll decide Pine Falls isn't worth the trouble." "Asymmetric warfare," Rabbit said, nodding. "Hit him where he's weak. Use his own size against him." "Exactly," Jack said. "I'm in," Stone said immediately. The others nodded their agreement. Maggie, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway listening, stepped forward. "You boys are going to get yourselves hurt. Or arrested. This man is dangerous." "Mrs. Hayes," Stone said gently. "With respect, ma'am, we've been in worse situations than this. And your son has never asked us for help before. Not once in all the years we've worked together. If he's asking now, it's because he needs us. And we don't leave our brothers behind." Maggie's eyes filled with tears. She looked at her son, surrounded by these hard, dangerous men who had come running at his call. "You found a good family, Jack." "The best," Jack agreed. Over the next week, the team went to work with military precision. Rabbit set up a sophisticated surveillance network, using hidden cameras and directional microphones to monitor Cross Development Group's local headquarters, a recently acquired building on the edge of town. They documented meetings, recorded conversations, and tracked the movements of Derek Klein and other key operatives. Doc and Grizz conducted discreet interviews with townspeople, gathering sworn statements and documenting damages. They approached people who'd been too afraid to speak out before, and with the reassurance of the team's protection, many opened up. Stone and Jack focused on the financial side, using Stone's contacts in federal law enforcement and Jack's research skills. They began tracing the ownership structure of Cross Development Group. What they found was a maze of shell companies, offshore accounts, and deliberately obscured paper trails. But hidden in the complexity was a pattern. Cross was over-leveraged. His Montana project was being funded by loans from a consortium of investors who were expecting big returns quickly. "He's in trouble," Stone said, pointing to a spreadsheet on Rabbit's laptop. "He's spent way more acquiring property here than he projected, and his timeline is slipping. If he doesn't start seeing returns in the next 6 months, his investors are going to get nervous." "So he's desperate," Jack said. "And desperate men make mistakes," Stone agreed. The mistake came sooner than they expected. Derek Klein, frustrated by the team's presence and the town's renewed resistance, decided to send a clear message. He chose old Bill Hendricks as his target, Bill's small hardware store. On Main Street was one of the last independent businesses holding out against Cross's offers. At 2 in the morning on a Wednesday, Klein and 2 of his men broke into Bill's store. They smashed displays, destroyed inventory, and spray-painted threats on the walls. Sell or burn. What they didn't know was that Rabbit had installed motion-activated cameras in every business on Main Street 3 days earlier. The entire break-in was captured in high-definition video. By dawn, Jack had copies of the footage uploaded to 3 different cloud servers, burned to a dozen DVDs, and sent to every news outlet within 200 miles. He also sent copies to the Montana State Attorney General's office and the FBI field office in Billings. Then he made one more call. "Mom, I need you to do something for me. It's going to seem strange, but I need you to trust me." 2 hours later, Maggie Hayes stood in front of Old Bill's vandalized store with a hand-painted sign that read, "This is what happens when you stand up to bullies." But we're not backing down. Rabbit had tipped off the regional news stations. By noon, 3 news vans were on Main Street. Maggie, the sweet-faced elderly woman whose son had been attacked in the initial confrontation, became the face of Pine Falls resistance. She gave interviews. She was calm, articulate, and heartbreaking. She talked about her late husband, about raising Jack, about the community she'd called home for 40 years. And she talked about being afraid, about watching her neighbors lose everything, about being humiliated by a rich man who thought his money made him untouchable. The story went viral. Within 24 hours, Pine Falls Fights Back was trending on social media. National news picked it up. Advocacy groups started calling. And suddenly, Damian Cross was no longer operating in the shadows. He was in the spotlight, and the light was harsh and unforgiving. Cross, watching from his penthouse suite in Billings, felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. His investors were calling, demanding explanations. His lawyers were scrambling. And worst of all, he was now a public villain, his face plastered across the internet as the embodiment of corporate greed destroying small-town America. He called an emergency meeting with Klein and his legal team. "Fix this," he snarled. "I don't care what it costs. Discredit the old woman. Claim the video is fake. Sue everyone. Just make this go away." His lead attorney, a shark named Richard Voss, shook his head. "Damian, we're past that. The video has been authenticated by 3 independent experts. The FBI has opened an investigation. If we push too hard now, it's going to look like witness intimidation." "Then what the hell am I paying you for?" Cross roared. "Damage control," Voss said calmly. "We need to offer a settlement. Give the town some concessions. Back off temporarily until this dies down." "I'm not backing down," Cross said, his face purple with rage. "This is my town. I bought it fair and square. And I'm not going to let some has-been soldier and his mommy ruin everything I've built." Klein, sitting in the corner, spoke up. "Then we need to change tactics. Stop going after property. Go after Hayes himself. Find his weak point and exploit it." Cross turned to him, his eyes glittering with malice. "Do it. I want him broken. I want him gone. I don't care what it takes." This was the message Rabbit intercepted from the bug he'd planted in Cross's office 2 days earlier. He played it for the team that night. "He's coming after you personally now," Stone said, looking at Jack. "This just escalated." "Good," Jack said. "Let him come. We'll be ready." But it wasn't Jack that Cross targeted. It was Titan. 3 days later, Jack returned from a supply run to find his mother's house surrounded by animal control trucks and police cruisers. His heart stopped. Sheriff Mathers, a portly man with a weak chin and calculating eyes, stood on the front lawn holding a clipboard. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice oozing false sympathy. "We've received a complaint that you're harboring a dangerous animal, a military attack dog without proper licensing or containment protocols. I'm afraid I'm going to have to impound the animal pending an investigation." Jack felt ice water flood his veins. Titan is a retired military working dog. He's fully trained and has never shown aggression toward any civilian. "That's not what the complaint says," Sheriff Mathers replied, consulting his clipboard. "According to this, your animal threatened and attempted to attack Mr. Derek Klein on 2 separate occasions." Mr. Klein felt his life was in danger. "Klein was on my property, threatening my mother," Jack said, his voice dangerously quiet. Titan was protecting her. "Be that as it may, Montana law is very clear about dangerous animals. I have a court order. The dog has to come with me." "Where's the order?" Jack demanded. "Let me see the paperwork." Mathers handed over a document. Jack scanned it quickly. It was a temporary impoundment order, signed by Judge Holbrook, the same judge who'd been a guest at Cross's fundraiser last month. The order claimed that Titan posed an immediate public safety threat and required him to be held in the county animal shelter pending a hearing. The county animal shelter was a kill facility. If Titan was classified as dangerous, he would be euthanized. This was Cross's play. If he couldn't beat Jack, he'd take away what Jack loved most. Jack looked at Titan, who was sitting calmly on the porch beside Maggie, his dark eyes watching the scene with alert intelligence. He was a warrior, like Jack. He'd saved lives. He'd bled for his country. And now he was being targeted because he'd done his job, protect. "You're not taking my dog," Jack said quietly. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Hayes," Sheriff Mathers said, gesturing to two of his deputies. "I have the broader authority to use force if necessary." "Then you'll have to," Jack said, moving to stand on the porch between the officers and Titan. "Because I'm not letting you kill my partner." The deputies looked uncomfortable. They were locals. Some of them had probably watched Jack grow up. They knew what he was, what he'd done, and they knew this wasn't justice. This was revenge. Sheriff Mathers, sensing the situation slipping out of his control, reached for his radio. "I'm calling for backup." "Hayes, you're making a big mistake." That's when Stone stepped out of the house, followed by Doc, Rabbit, and Grizz. 4 former Navy SEALs, all with the same hard, unwavering expression. "Sheriff," Stone said, his voice a low rumble, "you're going to walk away now. You're going to go back to your office, call whoever paid you to do this, and tell them it's not happening." "I have a court order," Mathers blustered, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. "You have a piece of paper signed by a corrupt judge," Stone countered. "That's not justice, that's a hit job, and we're not going to let it happen." The standoff lasted for a long, tense moment. The deputies, outnumbered and outmatched, looked to their sheriff for guidance. Sheriff Mathers, sweating despite the cold, realized he was in a fight he couldn't win. Not here, not now. "This isn't over," he said, backing toward his car. "I'll be back with a warrant for your arrest, Hayes. Obstruction of justice, resisting a lawful order. You just threw away your freedom for a dog." "He's not just a dog," Jack said. "He's my brother, and I don't abandon family." The sheriff and his deputies left, but Jack knew this was just a temporary reprieve. Cross had found his leverage. He would keep pushing until something broke. That night, the team gathered in Maggie's living room for a council of war. "We can't stay in Pine Falls," Jack said, his voice heavy. "If I'm here, I'm putting my mom in danger, and if they come back with a warrant, I'll have to go underground. That doesn't help anyone." "So what's the play?" Rabbit asked. Jack was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then, slowly, a plan began to form. It was risky, it was audacious, and it was exactly the kind of operation they'd been trained for. "We go after Cross directly," Jack said. "Not his property, not his employees, him. We find proof of his crimes, evidence so damning that even his corrupt friends can't protect him. And we make it public in a way he can't control." "You're talking about a break-in," Doc said. "His office. His files." "I'm talking about a heist," Jack corrected. "We get in, we copy everything, we get out. No violence, no property damage. Just information warfare." "That's illegal," Stone pointed out, though there was a gleam in his eye. "So is arson," Jack said. "So is intimidation. So is trying to put down a military working dog to hurt his handler. Cross has been breaking the law for years and getting away with it because he controls the system. It's time someone played by different rules." "I'm in," Rabbit said immediately. "I can crack his security systems." "Me too," Grizz rumbled. Doc and Stone exchanged glances, then nodded. "One condition," Stone said. "If we do this, we do it right. Full operational planning, reconnaissance, contingencies, no cowboys." "Agreed," Jack said. They spent the next 5 days planning. Rabbit hacked Cross's security systems remotely, mapping camera placements, guard rotations, and alarm protocols. Grizz and Doc scouted the building, noting exit points and weaknesses. Stone worked on timing and logistics, and Jack prepared for what would come after, because he knew that once they broke into Cross's files, there would be no going back. This would be total war. The operation was set for a Friday night, when Cross would be in Billings for an investor meeting. Jack, Rabbit, and Grizz would handle the infiltration. Stone and Doc would provide overwatch and extraction. At 11 p.m., dressed in dark clothes and carrying specialized equipment, the three men approached Cross Development Group's headquarters. It was a refurbished office building on the edge of town, guarded by cameras and a single overnight security guard. Rabbit disabled the cameras with a portable jammer. Grizz neutralized the guard using a sleeper hold, leaving him unconscious but unharmed in his chair. And Jack made his way to Cross's third-floor office. The door was locked with a digital keypad. Rabbit cracked it in under 30 seconds. Inside, the office was a monument to ego: mahogany furniture, expensive art, and a wall of windows overlooking the town Cross intended to conquer. Jack moved straight to the desk and the large safe built into the wall behind it. "Rabbit, I need this open," he whispered into his comms. "On it," Rabbit replied, appearing at his shoulder with an electronic device that looked like something from a spy movie. He attached it to the safe's keypad and began running bypass codes. 3 minutes later, the safe clicked open. Inside was exactly what they'd hoped for: file folders, hard drives, and a ledger that documented every illegal payment, every bribe, every intimidation tactic Cross had employed over the past 5 years. It was a criminal's masterclass in corruption, meticulously recorded by a man too arrogant to believe he'd ever be caught. Jack photographed every page, copied every hard drive, and documented every piece of evidence. The entire process took 45 minutes. As they were finishing, Jack's comm crackled. Stone's voice, urgent. "Jack, we've got company. 2 SUVs just pulled into the parking lot. It's Klein and at least 6 men. They know you're here." "Copy," Jack said, his training kicking in. "Rabbit, Grizz, we need to move. Now." They left Cross's office exactly as they'd found it. The safe locked, no evidence of their presence. But as they reached the stairwell, they heard voices below. Klein's men were coming up. "Roof," Jack ordered. They climbed 2 more floors and emerged onto the flat roof of the building. It was a 40-foot drop to the ground, too high to jump safely. They were trapped. Klein's voice echoed in the stairwell below. "We know you're up there, Hayes. There's no way out. Come down and we can talk about this like reasonable people." "Talk?" Jack called back. "Is that what you were doing when you burned down the community center?" "Prove it," Klein shot back. "You can't, just like you can't prove anything else. You're done, Hayes. You and your soldier buddies. I'm calling the sheriff right now. Breaking and entering. Trespassing. You'll be in jail by morning." Jack looked at Rabbit and Grizz. "Ideas?" "One," Rabbit said, looking at the next building over. It was a shorter structure, maybe 20 feet away across an alley. "But you're not going to like it." "Is it jumping?" Grizz asked. "It's jumping," Rabbit confirmed. Jack looked at the gap, the distance, the drop. In training, they'd made harder jumps. But that was years ago, with safety equipment on mats. This was concrete and darkness and a single chance. "We've made worse calls," Jack said. Grizz went first, his size giving him momentum. He hit the opposite roof hard, rolled, and came up signaling all clear. Rabbit went next, sailing across the gap like he'd done it 100 times. Jack took 3 steps back, heard Klein's men reaching the roof access door behind him, and ran. For a moment, he was airborne, the cold Montana night rushing past, the ground far below. Then his boots hit the opposite roof, his body remembering the training, rolling to absorb impact. Behind him, Klein and his men emerged onto the first roof. Klein looked across the gap, his face twisted with fury. "You can't run forever, Hayes," he shouted. "Don't need to," Jack called back. "I already won." They disappeared into the night, leaving Klein and Cross with the terrible knowledge that somewhere out there, Jack Hayes had evidence that could destroy them both. 3 days later, the Pine Falls Resistance, as the media had started calling them, held a press conference. It was broadcast live on local news and streamed online. Maggie Hayes sat at a table in the town's surviving church, flanked by Old Bill, Joanne from the diner, and a dozen other townspeople. In front of them were stacks of documents, hard drives, and photographs, and behind them, standing like silent sentinels, were Jack and his team. Maggie spoke, her voice steady and clear. For months, Damian Cross and his company have terrorized our town. They've intimidated us, threatened us, and committed crimes they believed they'd never be punished for because they controlled the law." She held up a document. "This is a ledger detailing illegal payments made by Cross Development Group to Sheriff Mathers, Judge Holbrook, and 3 county commissioners. This is evidence of arson, intimidation, and fraud. And this," she held up a hard drive, "contains years of recorded conversations documenting a criminal conspiracy." The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Maggie held up her hand for silence. "We're turning over all of this evidence to the Montana State Attorney General and the FBI, but we're also releasing it to the press. All of it. Because the people have a right to know what was done in the shadows." Within hours, the scandal exploded across Montana and beyond. News organizations pored over the documents. Federal investigators descended on Pine Falls. Sheriff Mathers and Judge Holbrook were immediately suspended pending investigation. And Damian Cross, watching from his penthouse, knew his empire was crumbling. He made one last desperate call to his lawyer. "Fix this, sue them, claim the evidence was illegally obtained. I don't care what it costs." "Damian," Richard Voss said, his voice heavy, "it's over. The FBI has enough to file federal RICO charges. You're looking at 20 years minimum. My advice? Start negotiating. A plea deal." Cross threw his phone across the room, shattering it against the wall. He'd lost. Not to the law, not to the system, but to a small-town widow and her Navy SEAL son who refused to be intimidated. 2 weeks later, federal agents arrested Damian Cross, Derek Klein, and 6 others on charges ranging from extortion to arson to bribery. The trials would take years, but the outcome was never in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming. Cross Development Group went bankrupt within a month, its projects abandoned, its investors fleeing, and Pine Falls, battered but unbroken, began to heal. 6 months after the arrests, the town held a celebration in the newly rebuilt community center, funded by donations that had poured in from across the country after the story went national. Maggie Hayes stood at the podium, looking out at her neighbors, her friends, her community, and in the front row, her son sat with Titan at his side, both of them finally at peace. "We learned something these past months," Maggie said. "We learned that we're stronger than we thought. That courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about standing up even when you're terrified. And we learned that when good people stand together, they can defeat any evil, no matter how powerful." She looked at Jack, her eyes shining with tears and pride. "And we learned that heroes still exist, not in the movies, not in stories, but right here, among us, willing to fight for what's right, willing to protect those who can't protect themselves." The room erupted in applause. People stood, cheering, crying, celebrating. Jack remained seated, uncomfortable with the attention, but his mother's smile made it bearable. After the ceremony, as people milled about with food and conversation, Stone approached Jack. "Hell of a mission," he said, clapping Jack on the shoulder. "Thanks for having my back," Jack replied. "Always," Stone said. "So what's next for you? Heading back to base?" Jack looked around the room, at the people laughing and rebuilding their lives, at his mother talking animatedly with Joanne, at the town that had fought so hard to survive. "I don't think so," Jack said slowly. "I think I'm staying. Someone needs to make sure this never happens again." Stone smiled. "Small-town sheriff, Jack Hayes, has a ring to it." "Something like that," Jack agreed. As the celebration continued, Jack slipped outside for air. Titan followed, as he always did. They stood in the parking lot under the vast Montana sky, stars scattered like diamonds across the darkness. "We did good, buddy," Jack said quietly, scratching Titan behind the ears. "You and me. We saved them." Titan looked up at him with those dark, intelligent eyes that had seen so much and gave a single, soft woof of agreement. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The mountains stood eternal and watchful. And in this small town at the end of the world, people slept safely, because one man had decided that protecting them was worth any cost. Jack Hayes had come home to rest. Instead, he'd found a purpose more important than any mission he'd ever undertaken. He'd found a cause worth fighting for and a family worth protecting. And in the end, that made all the difference. If this story of courage, loyalty, and standing up against impossible odds has touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that one person can make a difference. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate honor, sacrifice, and the quiet heroes among us. And tell us in the comments, what moment resonated with you most? Was it Jack's unwavering protection of his mother, Titan's loyal courage, or the community finding strength in unity? We read every comment, and your words inspire us. May God bless you and give you the courage to stand firm when faced with injustice, and the wisdom to know that true strength comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. If you believe that good will always triumph over evil, type Amen in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our community, and we'll see you in the next story.